I watched Dune the other day. Came out in 2021, and all my friends, my roommates, they all got together and they all watched Dune in the theaters. And they invited me, and I was like, absolutely not. I am not going to watch this in the theaters because I know that there's going to be a part 2. They've already announced it. I think they even announced that there might be like multiple parts or whatever. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to tough it out. I'll wait like 4 years until the sequel comes out. And then on that great day when they're both out, I'll watch them back to back, and it'll be the greatest day of my life because I'm sure that I'm going to love these movies because I like sci-fi. Everyone apparently says Dune is like the best sci-fi thing ever. The movie is made by or directed by what did he do? Denis Villeneuve or whatever his name is. He's basically made a bunch of movies that I think are really good. Let's see. Blade Runner 2049, Arrival, Enemy, Prisoners. Those are the ones I've seen. I think they're all at least 4 out of 5. Some of them would probably be like 5 out of 5. So yeah, I was very interested in these movies. And yeah, the other day I watched them both, which was fantastic. A great day, finally getting to watch them. So my overall thoughts on Dune 2. I'll do 1 and 2. And usually I guess this is where I would put like a score up on the screen, but you know what? We're doing a stream, so I don't have to do that. Generally, my take on these 2 movies is that they are both really, really well-made movies that are only let down by a very bland and standard story. Now, which is certainly interesting because these are based on books, and as far as I understand, the appeal of the books would be the story and the storytelling. So I was kind of surprised to see. I thought that I was going to appreciate, like, I guess the oh my god, the crazy amazing characters, and oh my god, the crazy like plot and all the sci-fi stuff is going to be so good and crazy and all that. But in reality, it just came down to like, it was just the actual movie elements themselves, like the visuals, the audio, like et cetera, like everything that makes a good movie is what makes these movies really stand out and being legitimately really good movies, more so than the story, I think. So yeah, that's my first thing. Next note, the audio stands out especially. Yeah, I think this is like, I'm very glad that I waited to watch this at home so that I could have my nice headphones on and, experience it in my nice dark room all by myself. And it was fantastic. I'm very glad I didn't watch this in the theater. It was the best choice I ever made. But yeah, the audio stands out especially. The music is really good. Particularly there's, I wish I could let me look at this. I don't know. I also don't really know the names properly. Sardaukar Planet or whatever chant thing. This music is so great. I've been listening to this on repeat or whatever. It's probably like one of the best scenes in this whole thing. Basically, this like whole thing is like fantastic, and I like this a lot. There's a lot of like throat singing and interesting like alien noises and stuff, and I think this is the sounds of this movie are really fantastic. Yeah, the throat singing on the planet, the main motif, which I'm sure if you've been on the internet, you probably know it. Dune main theme. I really like it. It's like some woman or something just making a noise. I don't know how to describe it. Where is it? It's like here, right? I like that. I think it's really good when it gets used in the movie. It just comes out of nowhere. It feels really epic. It like elevates the scene that it's being played in. I think the music is really good in this movie. I think the languages are also really cool. I don't know if they're actually like, for all I know, they could actually be real languages, like some language I just don't know, like Arabic or something, but they feel natural. They suit the actual tone of the characters and everything. Like, I guess the tone of the societies that they're based in. As far as I remember, there's like 2 main ones we get. Like we get English, obviously, but I think we definitely get the Fremen, like they have their language, the people on Arrakis or whatever. However, I think also the Harkonnens, I think they also have a language, because I think in the gladiator scene in part 2, I think they're talking another language. Anyway, basically, whenever we hear an alien language, it's like the greatest thing ever. I'm like, oh my god, this is so cool, and it sounds great. So that's great as well. And again, this is all like, so far, it's all been like what makes an actual good movie, stuff like this, less so than like story stuff. I think there's also a variety of like sound design things that are really, really well sound designed. Like whoever did the sound design thing on this is a genius, basically, and I think they're really good. Now I have a few things. One is, it's a particular scene where it's in part 1 where the Reverend Mother is talking to the Baron, and there's like a servant guy as well, and they're like basically the Baron is like sitting on the chair, and you got like the servant and the Reverend Mother, and they're all just like talking there, and they like initiate this like silence field or something, and it has like a really cool sound when it comes down, and when they talk in that silence, firstly you don't hear any dialogue and you only see the subtitles, which is so cool, and then they start talking, but when you hear the talking, it's really disarming because it doesn't just sound like natural dialogue. It sounds like it's being filtered by like this silence field that they're talking in. I thought that was really cool. That's a really good element of sound design. Then there's the Baron. I'm calling it, I could be completely like mistaking these names and everything, but the Baron, when basically his spine, like the gravity thing that makes him float, I think that's really cool. Like the sound it makes, it sounds very, I don't know, it sounds like Godzilla or something. I don't know, it's a really good design, sound design. The thumpers as well, they're really cool. Like I don't know how to do it, but it's a really cool design. And of course the voice, which is basically how do I even describe this? Like some magical thing. It's probably not magic. Some like science fiction thing that compels someone to do what you tell them. And it's got like a lot of heavy bass. It's got like the voice of this old woman like mixed in. It's really cool. Dune, the voice. I don't even know if I can find a clip on this. Surely, right? Every time the voice is used. Oh, this one obviously the best example in this whole movie. Damn.
Consider what you're about to do, Paul Atreides.
Silence!
Oh, it's so cool. Oh my god, I love it every time it happens. My god, I love the voice. Okay, that's all the sounds. All right, in Dune. The next overall thought this is like just the overall thoughts on the entire Dune experience. I guess like I said before, these movies together, as far as I understand, they adapt one book, which is like Dune, the book, which is one of like 6 books. And it's a very surprisingly very simple story. Like it's basically the story of an evil empire, which is like the emperor and like all his armies or whatever, who betray like a main character's family. And then that family is like a young boy who was in that rich and powerful family. And now he has to live with the poor and the common people. And he becomes one of them. And in fact, he's the chosen one who's actually going to overthrow the empire and lead these common folk into becoming back in power or something. That's basically what these 2 movies, the general storyline, which is obviously something that's been done a million times. Now, this is a book, as far as I understand, from the 1960s. So, like, I don't blame it for that. It's kind of, I was expecting a bit more, I guess, from this. Now, portraying it as a very simple story, it may sound like an extremely, like, very negative thing, but I think this is also really interesting to revisit such a simple story in a modern time where I have seen a million stories like this before. I think that the fact that the story is so simple, and the fact that it's a story about prophecy, and the fact that the final fight is left right until the final minutes of the movie, where you have the prophesized one fighting for basically ascending the emperor or whatever, I think this creates a very interesting dynamic where you don't know if the movie is intentionally being plain in its storytelling, telling a very simple story about a young boy who's prophesized to blah, 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 save the world, whatever. You don't know if the movie is actually going to commit to it and be a very simple story, or if it's waiting until the final minute of the final fight to subvert everything and to actually show that this isn't a story about prophecy. All the signs that have been pointing toward this person being the prophet is actually just reading into it. And you don't you don't quite know if this is a simple story or not. And I think that only works when you're revisiting a story like this in a modern era. So I think that was actually really interesting. Basically, this like the simple aspect of the story. Firstly, it's kind of, when I was watching part 1, I was like, okay, this is like, I was expecting a bit more. But by the time I got to the end of part 2 and they're having that final fight, I was very invested in that final fight because I truly thought that this was the moment that maybe the story will be subverted and Paul is going to die here and it's actually going to be like everything we were reading into it is wrong and blah, blah, blah. So I do actually like, in some element, that it was a very simple story. So yeah, that's the comments on the story. Now, when it comes to the actors, I think there's 4 that I've listed here that I think are really, really, really good actors and characters, and their presence and everything are fantastic. I guess more the acting rather than the characters. I haven't really thought too much about the characters, but I guess we'll get to that. Number 1 is the Baron. The Baron, Dune. This guy, he is fantastic, okay? Every scene is in, he basically is stealing all the attention in the scene. I just love it. I know him obviously from Chernobyl, and I know him from Andor. He probably also carried those 2 series. Well, I don't know who this is like something Skarsgård or something. He's like a famous actor. This guy is really good. Next up, there's also Lady Jessica. She is fantastic. I thought she was probably the highlight of part 1 in terms of, I mean, maybe she's the only compelling character in part 1, which I guess I'll talk about that. I have a very brief note about it. I like Jessica a lot. Performance-wise, I think she's also fantastic. And there's also one particular thing I really like, which is the really subtle smile right at the end of the final fight, or right at the beginning of the final fight, where Paul uses the voice on the Reverend Mother, and she just smiles, just subtly. And it's like a very bit of subtle acting. It's not very obvious that she's smiling in that moment, but I think that was really well done. So I think she is a really great actor. Next up, we have the Reverend Mother. I don't know I think that's her name. It might just be something else, because I'm sure she has a proper name. This is what I know her as. Dune 2. This lady. She is fantastic as well. She felt very, how do I describe this? She feels kind of like the Lady Olenna, I guess, if you've seen Game of Thrones. She feels like a very powerful woman in command, always in control, always knowing more than you. I think it was a really, really well portrayed performance. Like, this was really great. Finally, we have Stilgar, who is a very, what kind of energy does he give off? He gives off like the like best friend, not best friend, like the man who like kind of like a father figure, but also like is supporting like godfather or something. He's always got your back. But also he's a fanatic, like a very religious fanatic, and he's a comedy character as well. So he kind of sees the prophecy in everything, like every action that Paul takes. There is no action that Paul could take that would not reinforce the prophecy to him, which is, I guess, kind of an interesting character element to Stilgar. But yeah, I really like the performance. He feels like a very warm performance. Like immediately he is ingratiated to you. Like it really feels like you have a connection with him straight away when you're watching it. Fantastic. So yeah, those are some of my favorite performances, I think, in this. Now, one thing that I think I briefly mentioned already, which is about the voice. I don't know if it has like some technical term. I'm not actually a big Dune fan or anything. I don't know any of the lore here, but the voice, when they, can command people to do things, every scene that he gets used in is basically the coolest scene ever. I love the voice. It's so cool. Now I have a list here, a very brief list of my favorite stuff with the voice. One is obviously the first scene we get of the voice, which is when the Reverend Mother uses it on Paul. Mother, Paul, voice. It's the coolest thing ever. Where is it? All right.
You must do everything the Reverend Mother does.
You dismissed my mother in her own house.
Come here. Kneel.
That's just like the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. I love the Reverend Mother. I love the voice. It's the coolest thing. This movie, this like universe, I think one of the biggest intrigues is just the Bene Gesserit and the voice and everything. I think it's all really cool. And this scene was obviously the biggest use of it initially, and I think it really, really drawed me into the movie. Then we have Lady Jessica, who's killing the Harkonnens on the helicopter. I'm not going to pull this up, but that was also really cool because up until that point, you hadn't really seen her do anything powerful, and until that moment where you realize, Jesus, she is actually incredibly powerful. Then you have a more disturbing use of the voice, which really emotionally, like evocatively got to me, which is when Jessica forces it on Chani. Like she forces Chani to give Paul the blue liquid. And she's like, I don't even know. She's like, do it or something. And it's like, oh my God, she's taken away all her agency here. It's crazy. And so that was really cool. And then obviously we had the best use of the voice, which I just showed you, which was Paul using it on the Reverend Mother and Lady Jessica smiling. Because it's like, the Reverend Mother always feels like she's in control. She always feels like she's manipulating you. She feels like the stereotypical villain, but also not a stereotypical villain. How would you describe it? In the same way that like Olenna Tyrell would be a villain for the Lannisters, I guess. That's how the Reverend Mother feels like here, where it's like she is clearly a villain. She is not known to be a villain, but also all the people who are on her side know not to really trust her, but they know not to cross her. So to see her kind of be taken down a peg by Paul using the voice on her was really cathartic. And also just seeing Lady Jessica, who I think obviously was like tortured by this lady in her upbringing. It was really cathartic to see Lady Jessica smiling in that moment. So I thought that was really cool as well. So the voice, fantastic. Every scene with the voice, fantastic. And I have one last overall thought before I read all the chat. I'm sure there's a bunch. Is when it comes to part 1 and part 2, and CeeLo Pillard was speculating this on this before, I think they're very, to me, because the thing is I watched them back to back. So it's very difficult for me to kind of discern them as like two separate things, because I basically watched them in like 1 6-hour session. But to me, I think it's part 1 is incredibly front heavy in its quality. The first like half of part 1, like before the House of Treaties is like taken down, basically, I think all that stuff is some of the best stuff. It is the best stuff in that movie, and it is some of the best stuff like overall. Like it's all the introduction and world building and the slow like understanding of what Arrakis is like and everything. That stuff is all really good. But I think the last half of part 1 kind of is a bit like, it's a bit less interesting, a bit more generic-ish, where you're like kind of just, you're on the run basically. It's just less of an interesting element to me. And also it ends on a cliffhanger. So I'm incredibly glad that I waited for part 2 to be out to watch it straight away. On its own, it obviously doesn't stand up as a movie, but I'm not really evaluating it on its own, so I don't really care. But yeah, that's my thought on part 1. I think part 2 is pretty consistently great overall. So yeah, I think if you're directly comparing them as two individual movies, I think it's pretty clear that part 2 is better. But if you're like comparing it as one solid storyline, it'd kind of be like the beginning of part 1 is like some of the best stuff. Then it kind of dips a bit, and then it like rises back up to the kind of that beginning of part 1 level. So that's kind of how I would compare it. So yeah, so that's the overall thoughts. Okay, now there's a lot of chat, so Jesus Christ. Okay, Lead Ari be like, who's Frank Herbert? No, that's the author of Dune. I did a little bit of research into Dune. I do understand like there's some books. You know, I know there's like a God Emperor of Dune as a book, and it's like the coolest title ever. I think the voice sounds really lame in the movie. Well, you would be completely wrong, Sealer Pilled, because it's some of the best sound design in the movie. I love how it's a layered voice of very different people. I love the first time you hear Paul say it, who is a young boy. You hear the voice of an old woman speaking under his like young boy tone. I think it's really cool. And it also feeds into kind of like the power of these Bene Gesserit kind of manipulating Paul as well, potentially, because it's like everything he says with the voice is undertoned by the Bene Gesserit voice. I think it's really cool the way they did it. You know, the prophecy is fake, right? Well, that's like a big element. I think I have a few more notes on this. We'll talk about it later, but I think you'd be foolish to call it either fake or not. I think that, I don't know, maybe I'm sure there's more details in the novel to make it clearer, but in the movie, I would say there's no conclusive evidence in the end. But it is literally fake. The Bene Gesserit created the prophecy. Okay, wait. Okay. When we're saying the prophecy, as my understanding is that there's the prophecy on Arrakis with the Fremen. That is completely fabricated by the Reverend Mother of the planet or whatever. And the Bene Gesserit are slowly guiding the prophecy to make it so it's comfortable when one of their potential planned people to arise into this great power in Paul, or one of the Atreides, so they can have a nice comfortable life on Fremen, like on Arrakis. That's my understanding. That's a fake prophecy, or a planted prophecy. I think the more realistic aspect of a prophecy would be the Bene Gesserit trying to create this grand person who is incredibly strong and powerful and all-knowing, blah, blah, blah. I would say that we don't know if that prophecy is real or not, I guess. That's kind of what I would say. I don't know. But maybe I've missed details. I'm sure the movie probably also misses out details itself, so who knows. I'm back to my notes here. So, miscellaneous notes on Dune. Number one, I guess it is important to preface that a lot of details probably did go over my head. My first time through in the first actual Dune Part 1, I basically didn't know any of the names. I could not tell you what the Bene Gesserit was, or the Sardaukar, or there was basically a million names I didn't know. So as soon as I finished watching the first movie, the first thing I did immediately was make a list of all these names. I watched like a Dune Part 1 movie recap or whatever, and I just like wrote down all the names that I was trying to get. So Part 2 was a much more coherent experience for me, because I definitely understood everything that was going on way better than the first one. That's one miscellaneous note here. Next is that I don't think I mentioned this. So this is something that is really interesting to me. Now, maybe no one else really cares about this, but Dune opens with text that happens before the actual studio credits show up. So this is the opening of Dune. Dreams and messages from the deep with throat singing. And then it cuts to studios. Except here it's not going to show you, but you get like the studio logos or whatever, right? I think this is really interesting for two reasons. Now, one is that it plays with the meta of the actual story. Now, this is something I really like a lot and can value quite a lot in a lot of mediums, and especially anime, because when it comes to an anime, I think that a good opening and a good ending, like opening song and ending song, that tie in with the tone of the actual series can really elevate a series and make it feel special. Here, putting something before the text and before the actual studio logos and breaking the norm there and having this really interesting like music in the background and a very ambiguous message kind of, I think playing with the meta like this makes the movie feel special. And I know that's a very small thing, like who cares if a movie feels special, but to me, I kind of value that, because when I'm watching a movie, the whole experience of watching the movie is important to me. It's important when I get to the end credits. Do I feel like watching the credits? Is there anything special about the credits? Do I want to sit there in silence? I think that's important to me, how the credits are designed, for instance. I also think it's important what you do at the beginning of a movie, and I think this was just really interesting. That's on one regard why I think it's interesting. The second interesting is, I think also, second reason it's interesting is the actual text itself, where when you're watching this movie, the first thing you see is that they say that dreams are messages from the deep. I think that if you are a person viewing this for the first time like I was, this kind of implicitly primes you to think that the dreams are going to be significant and have meaning. So this again plays in with, I guess, what I was trying to argue with Heath about a little bit, but maybe I got that a bit wrong, and I'm sure Heath knows more than me. But I think this is an interesting thing to do to a movie where prophecy and dreams are like a core element to the intrigue of the movie and I guess the resolution at the end of Part 2. When you're watching the movie, if this didn't exist, then there is a bigger element of like, are these dreams actually real? Are they just manipulations? Are they really going to happen? Like, what's the point of them? What's their significance? Are they significant? Etc., etc. Priming the audience like this to say that dreams are messages from the deep gives it more of a like, it makes it feel more significant. And like, these actually are messages that are coming from a deeper place, right? Like they have some inherent significance, and they're not just delusions. They're not just like manipulations. These are messages that are intrinsically coming from the depth of the universe or something. Now, who knows if this message is true or not, but I think to put this at the beginning of a film is like kind of an interesting approach. Now, that's just my interpretation. I'm sure the director has probably come out and said that there's some reason he's done this for. I don't care. That's my interpretation. The next miscellaneous note is that I really like the opening of the first movie. I have seen a few reactions. I've seen the normies and I've seen Blind Wave. Like, I've seen a few things. I haven't watched any straight out reviews besides hearing that Destiny didn't like it. Now, I can see a lot of people probably, especially if you like the book, probably having an issue with the beginning of the movie because it's a lot of telling and not showing. Or it's a lot of telling and showing, where it's literally just the narrator talking about like setting up the galaxy or whatever and explaining all the lore. I think that was really cool. All right. I don't have an issue with like telling and showing and all that. I think it was just so cool. Like, you have the drum-like music that's like building up, and I think that's really good. It basically just feels really epic, and it sets the tone of like a sci-fi, like a really well thought out like sci-fi world or whatever. And I think it's really cool. It has the overbearing sound effects of the machinery. I think it's really cool. It's like mixed in with the machinery. You have a lot of sound, a lot of sand sounds, and a lot of explosions and stuff. I think it immediately throws you into the fact that the movie is going to be very, very dependent on the sound, kind of. And I think that does a good job of setting that up in the introduction. The cinematography is also really well done with the very thick sand and the sandy dust is more what it is, where it's, I don't know what to say beyond it. It just looks really good, and I like it how it looks. You see the grand scale of the sci-fi elements, like you see like hundreds of Harkonnen ships and stuff. I think that's all really well done. And you actually get the monologue, which I was saying that some people probably would have an issue with. I like the way the monologue is delivered. This is Chani delivering this monologue, and she's talking about how, oh, oppression is all I've ever known. She's talking about an emperor, which is all really fascinating, like sci-fi stuff. She talks about the Harkonnens being richer than even the emperor, which is really interesting. And I really like the way she delivers the final line, which is, but one day, I can't deliver it, but she says, but one day, by imperial decree, they were gone. Why did the emperor choose this path? And who will our next oppressors be? And then you cut to the logo, and it's an interesting mystery. It's an interesting, like, who's narrating this? Who is this person? It's intrigue. It's so good. It's such a great intro. And there is one thing it reminds me of, which is the opening of Dark City. Particularly I think this is the theatrical release of Dark City, which basically opens with a monologue from a particular character, and it feels very familiar. And I do wonder if like the director was referencing this or not. But this, I believe I can play this as well because it's quite old and it is on YouTube. So let's see.
First, there was darkness.
It's like a mix of the sci-fi, the narrator, and the music in the background. Feels very much like the Dune opening. And I really like this as well. There's another kind of opening to a movie that I love, that I know a lot of people have issues with as well. Right?
They were a race as old as time itself. They had mastered the ultimate technology, the ability to alter physical reality by will alone. They called this ability tuning.
You kind of get the point. It's like an opening sci-fi monologue, which I think is really cool. So go watch Dark City if you're interested, because I think that's a really good movie as well. Anyway, next miscellaneous note. There is a lot of world building and lore in this. Now, one, we've already talked about this, but we have the Sisterhood. We have the Bene Gesserit, I think it's how it's pronounced, who execute plans on this time scale of centuries. That's a cool sci-fi world building lore concept. I like it. The concept of an emperor that rules the entire universe is, I think, how they portrayed it in this is really interesting as well. The idea that spice is integral to everything, including interstellar travel. That's really interesting. And also the fact that we never, and I'm sure maybe there is a way, maybe they do hint this and I just missed it, but we never really understand how it helps with interstellar travel. I think it's kind of cool that they didn't explain it. And it's like, it leaves it open to interpretation. Like, is it used to fuel ships? Like, that would be the most straightforward thing. Is it used somehow to navigate ships? Like, is it used as like a shielding for the ships? Like, how do you actually use it? Does it give you knowledge? Like, is it the knowledge of how to build these ships or like how to travel across the stars or something? I think it's really interesting that we don't find out, but maybe someone will tell me that we do find out and make it a bit worse, but yeah. And obviously it's like a sand planet. It's like a classic sci-fi thing at this point, thanks to Star Wars, but that's also a kind of cool, a little bit of sci-fi in this. Okay. Well, then I have my note about how I love the sounds. I stand by that. The visuals are great. The pacing is great. Oh yeah, okay. This is also a big thing, I think, which is that, yeah, I just basically, I wish this movie, or both of them, I guess, were longer. I think they're too short, which is interesting to say because I think they are like, they're pretty long. Dune Part 1 runtime. Yeah, it's like, I guess it's not really that long. I think this would have been served better by like a 4-hour movie for the first one and the second one. I think both of them would have, like, I happily was invested enough and the pacing was good enough that I was engaged the whole time. That by the time I got to the end, I was like, God damn it, I wish this just continued. So I would have been happy if these were like way longer. Yeah, but I do like the pace, and I think it was, yeah, I just wish it was longer. Now I do have a not more generic, what am I saying? This movie basically has two kind of vibes to it, or two kind of distinct sub-universes within this. There's Arrakis, which is like the hearty, rough, like poor society that are like, they're happier, but they're living more in poverty or whatever, right? Like you have that kind of society setting on they're set on a desert planet, and they don't have many resources, and they're like really, basically we have that kind of like a society in this movie. And then we have the other element, which is like the Harkonnens and the Imperial Army, the sort of Sardaukar or whatever, which are living on like, they have monolithic structures as their designs, and they live on very like wet planets with no dust, and they're basically very different. Like they're more like really high-tech sci-fi stuff, whereas the people of Arrakis, although they do still have like high-tech sci-fi, they're more of the relatable, earthly underdogs, lower class kind of people as well. Of these two stories, the story of Dune, both two movies, really spend a lot more time on the Arrakis stuff, obviously, because it's called Dune. The planet used to be called Dune. Obviously, they're the focus of the book, right? And the movie in as a result. I find that stuff far less interesting, because to me it feels way more earthly, way more familiar, and way more real, and I don't like it. Now, it's obviously I do like it. These movies are really good. But of the two storylines, I wish there was more of a focus on the really out there sci-fi, monolithic structures, dark environments, throat singing. I wish there was more of that in the movie. More of the Harkonnens, more of their Imperial Army, more of that stuff. Less of the sand stuff, which, you know, is kind of like a strike against the whole premise of the movie. But yeah, that's kind of my take. And the thing I compare it to is when it comes to the Matrix, there's the city of Zion, or whatever it's called. There's basically, that's like the equivalent to Arrakis and the Fremen. And then there's the world of the machines, or the really like the Harkonnens and the Empire and all that. It's like a very similar divide in the Matrix, which I'm sure is probably inspired by Dune, or like a million stories that Dune was inspired by. But I always was more appealing. I never really liked Zion, and I always was much more interested in the world of the machines. It visually looks more, like it's aesthetically more appealing, and it's also more fascinating on like a story level as well. And it's just better sci-fi in my opinion, or more interesting sci-fi. So that's another miscellaneous note. Now, another kind of thing, which I'm not sure if I stand by now that I've seen both movies, but I guess I kind of do, which is that the top-notch cinematography, directing, music, sound, and the incredibly serious tone without much levity is, I think, what makes this a really good movie. That if this was a more generic, or like if this was made in the fashion of a modern blockbuster, like an MCU movie, or just some random like novel, like pretty recent like action movie, I don't think this movie would be anywhere near as good as it is. I guess this also ties in with the fact that I don't think it's really the story that carries this, or the characters or anything. I think it really is like the filmmaking that carries these movies. I guess it's just kind of extension of that. Next note about the characters. So none of the characters in the first movie were compelling whatsoever, except for Lady Jessica. And I think the reason she appeals to me a lot is that we get a lot of implied backstory. Now, I did miss a lot of the details in the first one, potentially, because, you know, I didn't understand a lot of the names and stuff, so you can correct me if I got anything wrong. But my understanding is that there's a very heavily implied backstory of her living, or not implied, but she was raised by the Bene Gesserit, and she kind of had an abusive upbringing, where this mother-like figure, this like evil stepmother figure in the Reverend Mother, clearly Jessica fears her, and I think it's just really, it's not a very particularly like in-depth like character thing or anything, but it's enough for me to like grasp onto it and be like, I like Jessica as a character. Yeah, it's like it feels like she was raised in this like religious order. She's trying to get away from it, but she can't. Like she's too afraid to kind of get away from it, and not. Yeah. I think it's just really interesting. Yeah. Now, there's something else I wanted to say about this. Oh yeah, so Lady Jessica says, she has this like saying that she says a few times whenever she's like scared, and I think Paul says this as well. She says fear is the mind killer, and she kind of has like this speech about it. Now I'm certain that this has got to be like some book thing that becomes important later or whatever, and there's some reveal. Surely this is a thing, because they say it too many times and it's too specific of a phrase. But my interpretation of this is that I'm sure it has some lore meaning, whatever. I don't care. For me, this is just like, it feels like whenever Jessica is saying these in these moments of fear and just not feeling Yeah, just fear. It feels like she's calling back to her childhood, where she was just a little girl that like had to cope with the terrible life that she was living under the Bene Gesserit. And it to her, she's like, either these are the lessons that were being taught to her when she was younger, that fear is the mind killer and you have to be strong and not be afraid. And she's kind of trying to use the lessons of the Bene Gesserit to not be afraid of the Bene Gesserit, or it is something that she told herself, or there was like a kinder person who was with her that taught her this when she was younger, and she's trying to kind of cope with it now that she's older. I think I hope it's not a lore thing, because I think it's a really interesting character thing. And that's kind of my current interpretation until it gets proven wrong in subsequent films or whatever. I think it's really interesting. So beyond that, the action is the weakest part of part 1. So there's basically, I get it kind of steps up in part 2 is what I would say. Like there's, I have a list here, so we'll go through it. But when in part 1, there's like 3 types of action. There's 1, a bunch of stuff blowing up. Basically, sci-fi ship sends missile, things blow up. And I'm like, okay, interesting, but also really boring. Now, I do appreciate the scale of it. The movie portrays the scale of the explosions and the ships and all the sci-fi, like big warfare stuff. It portrays that really well. Like it feels important and big and all that. But it's still just like press button, thing blow up. I'm like, okay. The second type of fighting is just very simple sword and like hand-to-hand fighting stuff, where you have an added element of the sci-fi shields, which are like basically what you see in the fights is like people with swords, they're doing generic like fighting, but they like glow red and blue because it's like they got these sci-fi shields around them. This is also, it can be good. In part 1, it wasn't. In part 2, it was a lot better. But in part 1, it's just like there's nothing really stood out to me. It's like, wow, that was really cool. Like hand-to-hand sword fight. It was just like generic sword fight you see in like a Marvel movie or something. I don't know. It was fine. Kind of boring. Then the third kind of action in part 1 is basically just running through a desert to get away from a worm. And that's kind of, it's like it happens a few times. It's not necessarily running. I guess it is running from a worm, but it's also just like running away from the heat of the desert or whatever. It happens a few times and it's kind of like, okay, when I saw this the first time, it was okay. But every time we have to run now, I'm like, okay, we're running now. It's like not very interesting. So I do think the action in part 1 was kind of, not a letdown, but it was kind of the weaker element of part 1. The action of part 2 is a lot better. And I have like a list here of the stuff that I thought was really good. Number 1, the riding the sandworm scene, I think was portrayed really cool. Even just like the build up of it. I think I have like a note on this later, but like the build up of like, okay, I hope it's a big one. And then the big one comes and like, oh Jesus, I didn't mean that big. And just like, it takes a while and it's like approaching and you got the build up of the worm approaching and then it goes through and then it's like a massive, like, it feels like a gargantuan effort for him to kind of land on the thing and hook the little hooks and actually stand up. And it's a really cool action piece. I like that. Then we have the black and white gladiator fight, which is visually probably the coolest thing in this whole, like, what a cool idea to like just portray this like evil planet as like just black and white. It's so cool. But the fighting in that actual gladiator fight was really cool. Cool action there. In the climactic battle at the end of part 2, the 3 I think it was 3, maybe it was 2, whatever, 2 or 3 worms coming in at the end and basically just like eating the entire army. That was really cool action. The final battle where you got I don't know exactly, I would assume it's like the Harkonnens and maybe the Sardaukar as well, when they're fighting against the Fremen, and it's like basically the 2 armies clashing in like the Lord of the Rings / like Battle of the Bastards kind of approach, where it's basically just 2 massive armies clashing. That was really well done. I like that. And of course, I really like the final sword fight between Paul and, I wrote his name down here, I would not have recalled this, but Feyd-Rautha. Yeah, I like that final fight. It is undoubtedly the best choreography in this whole thing. The most interesting fight, the most compelling fight from a story reason, for the reason I talked about before, having to do with the prophecy and all that. So yeah. Now, there's the issue with the characters. What is this? I said part 1 suffers from a few characters. Oh yeah, so there's a few characters in part 1, and this isn't an issue in part 2 at all, so it was just the beginning of part 1, where characters feel very out of place, and they feel like they're from our universe, like modern day in our universe. And the ones I've listed are Paul, main character, Paul's dad, Jason Momoa, I don't know, it was like Duncan or something, and Thanos. I don't remember what his name is, but the guy who was like teaching Paul how to fight. They all feel like very modern, like the way they're dressed, the way they act, the way they talk, like it all just feels very modern and feels out of place. Like it feels too contemporary, I guess. Okay, next note. I think the worms are a very cool visual concept. Like they look really cool. I kind of can see them being like portrayed symbolically in the world as gods or something, because it's like, oh my god, they got like this big mouth that is kind of like an eye that's looking down on you. It's really cool. But I don't understand why they're so heavily featured in like the marketing. I guess just maybe because it just looks cool. But I just wonder if there's like a bigger lore reason for this, like in the Dune lore, like why are the worms like so important? Like, are they going to be important later on, or is this just like a thing in this first book? Or I have no idea. But yeah, worms are interesting. Some of the technology also feels a bit too earthly. As far as I understand, this is like our universe, but like set in the year like 10,000 or something. Maybe it's not our universe. Maybe that's why it feels like earthly, I guess. But a lot of when I say earthly, I mean like for instance, the helicopter dragonfly ships, which have basically they're too mechanical and they feel too familiar. Like they just look like helicopters and they have like mechanical parts to like move. And you've got like when they're trying to collect dust and they got the big like car basically that's like it's got, what do you call them? The tracks or whatever. Like they have the actual thing around the wheels. It feels too familiar, and I wish it was more sci-fi. So yeah. Then, I just said that this I've never ever heard of Dune be referenced as like an inspiration for Star Wars, but it like obviously is. And I feel like someone said that before in the comments, but like there's a sand planet, obviously Tatooine or whatever. There's like a space scale empire. There's like the prophecy of like a chosen one. There's like the terminology of spice and space sports. Like those are like things that are in Star Wars. And there's like obviously the voice is like a parallel to the Force as well. So I wonder if like somehow I've just missed interviews from like George Lucas or like people involved in the original trilogy for just referencing Dune as a reference. But for some reason, I've just never heard it referenced ever in regard to Star Wars. But I'm sure it influenced it. It had to have. Anyway, the subversion of the Emperor. This is interesting. So throughout the entirety of part 1, you never see the Emperor and is just referenced off screen. And I was kind of like, oh my God, is this going to be one of those Palpatine things where it's like you don't see him in the first 2 movies and then you finally see him in the last one, and I'm going to be waiting like 20 years to finally see what the Emperor looks like. But no, we do see the Emperor in the opening of the second movie, which I think was really cool. But another really cool thing about seeing the Emperor is that he's not really a character. We see the Emperor through the daughter's eyes. Like the first scene we get of the Emperor is him just sitting quietly, not saying anything. And firstly, there's so much to say, but firstly, he's like a subversion of what you were expecting, at least what I was expecting. Because you're meant to, in the first movie, he's portrayed as this like evil, crazy, powerful emperor who's in control and sending armies to destroy bloodlines. And he has dominion over his dominion is the entire universe or whatever. And you think he's going to be like a Palpatine, powerful, like crazy, evil guy. And then you see him in the next movie, and he's kind of just this old man. Like, he's just like if you didn't tell me he was the Emperor, I'd have no idea. He's just like sitting in his chair or sitting in the garden or whatever. And that's a very interesting subversion, which I thought was cool. And then again, back to what I was saying, another element of the subversion is that you have the daughter. I mean, it's not really the subversion. You have the daughter who is giving the description of her father, and we never really get the Emperor's character itself until maybe right at the end when he like kisses Paul's hand. But it's like the daughter talking about how she doesn't really understand her father, and like why like after the fall of House Atreides he was just silent. And it's like, this is a very interesting portrayal of an all-powerful emperor. I thought it was really cool. Like seeing a weak old man basically as the Emperor was I liked it a lot. It was really cool. One thing both movies completely fail at is portraying the heat of the desert. Never once, not a single time watching these movies did I feel like the desert was hot at all. There was no one sweating. There was no one panting. It didn't feel hot at all, which is, I feel like that's probably something you should probably focus on, because it is a big like plot element about how you can't be out here too long. Like the desert is dangerous. It just didn't feel hot at all. I think they completely failed that from a visual perspective, from any perspective, I guess. Besides like writing, it's obviously in the writing, it's very clear. But other than that, it was completely failed. We're getting there. Okay, we got 2 more notes here and then like a bunch of other stuff. But I couldn't believe that Lady Jessica survived the whole 2 movies. That was another thing that I was shocked by, because Paul obviously loses his dad pretty early in the first movie. And I was expecting, okay, by the end of part 2, maybe she'll die in this fight with the Fremen that they're doing. But no, she survived and she became like a big character in part 2. So I was surprised by that. And a very other miscellaneous note here is that the visual of the fetus at the beginning of part 2, and I guess throughout all of part 2, is a amazing visual thing. I think it's so cool to have like a character talk and show a visual of a fetus like literally on screen as they're talking. So that was sweet. Okay, now I'm sure there's some chats here. Okay. Film buff would have remembered all the names in the first time through. Absolutely he would have. God, I wish Film buff reacted to it. That'd be great. I'd love to watch that reaction. In the book, every chapter has a piece of writing from the future at the start, so it might be in reference to that. Oh, that would be interesting. I kind of like that. That's neat. The audiobook is 21 hours for your information. Oof, I could get through that in like a week. Maybe I should read it. The action is off-putting for me too. Apart from like the 3 important 1v1 duels, there's almost no action in the books. I guess that makes sense. Okay, cool. Well, the tech in Dune can't be too sci-fi because computers are outlawed by the Empire. I didn't know that. But actually, now that I completely forgot about that until this moment right now, my dentist, I don't know if I talked about this on stream, my dentist told me about Dune. And I couldn't like stop talking to him because he was like in my mouth, like, you know, cleaning my tooth and everything. He started talking about Dune. And he talks about how, I guess now that you've said it, it reminded me. Yeah, the computers are outlawed or something. And then they, instead of that, they like went down the genetic engineering routes, and like the AI was like, AI is somehow important. I don't remember, but yeah, it was interesting. I was really interested in that. Yeah, maybe I should read these books. Who knows? Every writing is from Irulan. I don't know who Irulan is as well. It's like a collection of her history books. I don't know who Irulan is. Should I remember that? Is she the Reverend Mother? Maybe. I feel like she's going to be like the final boss or something. Probably not though. Probably not. She feels more like the Palpatine kind of character. Oh, the Emperor's daughter. Okay. All right. I'm just going to like blast through this. Now that I have like I have a section about very miscellaneous notes from part 2 that I couldn't be bothered to organize. So I'm just going to read these out. Okay. Okay. It's cool how they extract water from every dead body. Lamau, they don't even drink the sacred water. That's a really dumb thing. They should definitely drink it. They don't even cry because it gives away water. That's great. Oh shit, she's given the speech from the opening of the first movie. Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low. Oh yeah, so these are notes from part 2. But yeah, she does actually, that was kind of interesting, where in the opening of part 1, you have this like monologue that I was ranting about how great it is. And they have a particular shot there where you see like the sand dunes and the spice is flowing or whatever. And she says a particular line about the place being beautiful when it's low. And then into part 2, they show the exact same shot and she says the exact same dialogue. And it's like, oh, this is really interesting. This feels like a much more normal movie. Like it's integrated. Oh yeah, it's like the classic story trope of being integrated into a new culture. It's got the love story. It has more comedy. The bad guys are slowly losing and they have to strike back harder, etc., etc. Riding the worm was pretty sick. I'm guessing the girl he is following in the vision is his sister. I guess that was kind of right, I think. Bro, this black and white gladiator arena, so sick. The march in the city after the kiss ceremony. God, every visual in this evil city is damn amazing. I don't know what I meant by that, but there you go. It's crazy that they're still using nukes in the year 10,000. Surely there would be a more effective method like viruses or acid or something. But then again, this story was written in the 1960s, so fair enough. They probably thought that nukes were going to end the world, so whatever. The water of life is the blue fluid from inside the baby worm. That's interesting. Man, Stilgar is so great. I love how strongly he's resisting going to the south. He really doesn't want to start a universal war. That was cool. Lady Jessica is the daughter of the Baron, I think. I wrote Born, but I'm pretty sure that it's Baron, i.e. her and Paul are Harkonnens. She didn't know this until the blue liquid. I also wrote, this is such a weird plot twist. It doesn't feel important, but the movie plays it as though it's like a really giant twist, which I guess I stand by that. Like, I don't know why it's so important that that Paul was like the son of the Baron, like at the end. Like it really just, I didn't care about that at all. I guess what it does is it implies that the Bene Gesserit are like forcing these marriages, or they're like kind of manipulating everyone at this point. I guess it's kind of what it's more interesting, the one interesting thing about it. Heath says, the sacred water is for terraforming the planet though. To the Fremen, completing their goal of turning Dune green is the most important thing. Did I like completely miss that? I don't remember that at all. I guess maybe when they were in the terraforming place, maybe there was like blue water there and I missed it. That's interesting. Okay. Lamau, the name drop. The planet had a name, Dune. That was like a kind of cool scene. I guess there was a lot of also screaming and stuff, like from Paul. Like I think he would, all the screaming scenes, like yelling and being charismatic and all that, they were really well done. Like he was a good actor in those scenes, I guess. That was really cool. He gives a great speech. It was foolish of the Emperor to come here, but I suppose he's being manipulated into this. Oh yeah, there's Drax or Batista or whatever. He's in this movie and he plays like a villain character who basically fumbles every single interaction he has. Like he loses every fight immediately, and it was kind of weird. I was like, oh, I figured he'd have like one good fight, but no, he just like every single interaction he had was a complete failure for him. So that was really interesting in a bad way. The smile, I talked about this. Jesus, what a way to keep the fight till the end. I actually thought he was going to die and the white bald guy was going to become the prophet. True. This feels like it's a young adult's book. It's so damn straightforward, but maybe because it's so old. So there you go. Oh my God. That's a lot of talking. How long was that? Jesus, an hour long? I think it's a way to make Feyd-Rautha seem stronger as he's related to Paul. Oh, sure. I can see that. It's also ironic because if Jessica had a girl like she was supposed to, Fern Paul would have been married to Feyd-Rautha. Fem Paul would have been married to Feyd-Rautha. Okay, that is pretty funny. Sure. All right, Dune. That's it. I did it. Oh my God. Jesus Christ.